In July 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte was finalizing the Treaties of Tilsit on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. Having recently crushed the Prussian army at Jena and the Russians at Friedland, he was now the absolute master of the European continent. To celebrate, his chief of staff organized a massive hunt, but instead of wild hares, the organizers purchased up to 3,000 tame domestic rabbits from local farmers. When the cages were opened, those 3,000 hungry animals formed a single relentless gray wave. Domesticated animals don't flee from humans, they expect to be fed. The rabbits converged on the emperor, climbing his legs and nipping at his gold-braided jacket. The conqueror of Europe found himself swatting desperately with his riding crop before being forced into a frantic, scrambling retreat to his carriage. The man who had stood firm under the fire of Austrian batteries at Lodi was forced to cede the field to a huddle of hungry hares. It was a moment of unguarded comedy, proving that even a master strategist can completely misjudge the instincts of the living things around him. The image of the emperor fleeing a horde of bunnies is completely at odds with his carefully constructed reputation. Napoleon spent his entire career ensuring the public saw him only as a military genius and an invincible world leader. He understood that public perception and morale were equally critical to his battlefield tactics. He famously noted that in war, morale and public opinion comprise the better part of reality. Because of that philosophy, his historical legacy would ultimately be decided by a ruthless, ongoing battle over who controlled his narrative. You might reasonably suspect the rabbit attack is a complete myth, but if we trace the historical paper trail, we find a surprisingly well-documented disaster. The earliest accounts appear as anti-Bonapartist propaganda in 1810 by Louis Goldsmith, who claimed the rabbits licked the emperor's boots. 20 years later, Napoleon's own valet, Constant Wary, published ghost-written memoirs validating the core event, noting the tame rabbits simply mistook Napoleon for their keeper. The most famous and dramatic account comes from the posthumous memoirs of General Paul Thibault. He described the rabbits as a relentless phalanx, performing coordinated triple conversion flanking maneuvers against the emperor. Thibault had a bitter, lifelong grudge against the man who organized the hunt, so he highly exaggerated the military tactics of the animals for political revenge. Yet across all these conflicting accounts, historians agree the humiliating failure of the domestic rabbit hunt actually happened. To understand why a bungled hunt mattered so much, we have to look at the massive public relations machine Napoleon built. He aggressively managed media across the French Empire to manufacture his golden legend. In Jacques-Louis David's painting, Napoleon distributes the eagle standards. The art frames him as a godlike, commanding presence among adoring troops. State-sponsored propaganda like this was explicitly designed to project an unassailable Roman-style authority. The goal was to entirely erase any human weakness or vulnerability from the public eye. Across the English Channel, the British press launched a relentless countermeasure. A caricaturist named James Gilray quickly emerged as Napoleon's greatest adversary in the image war. In this grotesque feast depiction, Gilray bypasses censorship, producing gritty caricatures that directly attack the emperor's fragile masculinity, low-class origins, and sexual insecurities. Gilray eventually invented the persona of Little Boney. He drew the emperor as a frantic, 6-inch Lilliputian throwing childish tantrums. These cartoons were devastating because they weaponized the freedom of the press to strip away the golden legend. By downsizing a terrifying conqueror into a pathetic joke, Gilray created an entirely different narrative for the European public to consume. While Napoleon dominated the physical battlefields of Europe for over a decade, he ultimately lost the image war. The black legend built by British satirists successfully hijacked his long-term cultural legacy. The ghost of Gilray's Little Boney lives on in the modern concept of the Napoleon complex, the enduring psychological theory that short men are aggressively overcompensating for their stature. We see it in the Napoleon delusion trope. This photograph of an imposing stone asylum anchors the reality of where this psychiatric cliché was popularized, the idea of a crazy person pacing a ward with a hand tucked inside their coat. Through relentless psychological trivialization, the public image of a world shaper capable of rewriting laws and borders transitioned into a comedic punchline in pop culture. There is an irony in how imperial machines function. Napoleon's military was designed to fight other systems, to counter batteries and professional infantries, but it had absolutely no protocol for a non-combatant that refused to follow the established rules of engagement. Napoleon successfully defeated the massive, organized armies of Prussia and Russia, yet he was completely powerless against a swarm of hungry domestic rabbits and the acidic ink of a British cartoonist. Artillery can conquer continents and redefine borders, but while Napoleon's empire eventually collapsed, the image of the conqueror versus the bunnies survived. In the long war for his legacy, a few thousand hungry rabbits and a handful of British cartoons proved remarkably hard to defeat.